This is Curious Minnesota, a Star Tribune project that sends staff from the state's largest newsroom hunting for the answers to great questions we receive from you, our readers. We're here to answer everything you want to know about the state's people, places, and culture.
Welcome to Curious Minnesota. I'm your host, Eric Roper. Today's episode of Curious Minnesota is sponsored by Primrose Schools. I used to go skiing as a kid, downhill skiing, and I vividly remember the rush of speeding down those mountains. And the other thing that I remember were these little jumps that you'd encounter here and there. And, you'd sort of test your courage by cruising up to the jump and then flying through the air and trying to stick the landing. Well, that is a tiny, tiny, tiny version of what we're talking about today, which is the sport of ski jumping. Ski jumping has been part of the Olympics for a century, and while it began in Norway, I was surprised to learn that the sport got its American start here in Minnesota back in the late 1800s, thanks to some thrill-seeking Norwegians. Joining me today is Erica Pearson, who wrote a fascinating story on this topic for Curious Minnesota. This question came from reader Jeff Syme. Here's Jeff.
Well, I grew up in southwest Minneapolis, and when I was a kid in the early 70s, I used to see ski jumps at Bush Lake Park. And I'm not sure if that jump is still there anymore or if it's in service, but I was really impressed with these high school kids probably who were jumping off that ramp, and it was just so impressive. And I thought, wow, those people are really courageous and possibly a little nutty. I more recently saw an old photo on the wall at Theodore Wirth Park, and it was probably from about the 40s maybe. And there were hundreds of people gathered at this event, and it just looked like a really cool event. And all those things got me wondering, what is the history of ski jumping in Minnesota?
Thanks to Jeff for that question. Now on to my conversation with Erica. Well, Erica, thank you so much for joining us today. So, ski jumping. I admittedly did not know much about this, and I actually didn't know the Minnesota history of this, so I learned a ton reading your story. Before we get into the whole history, tell us about there's something really unique about doing this activity that people who've done it told you, what it's like. So let's just talk about what's the draw? I mean, because it sounds like it's very unique.
Yeah. Well, I was curious after driving past the Bush Lake jump many times.
Where is that?
That is in Bloomington.
Okay.
And I just wanted to know, what does it feel like to be up in the air and looking down and getting ready to land? So I reached out to one of the Minneapolis ski jumping coaches named Peter Guy, and he said it feels like being a kite in the air. He told me it's at once thrilling and cerebral, dreamlike, and the epitome of reality. And I think the
epitome of reality.
Yeah, because reality, the ground is very real.
Yeah, right. Wow. Okay. The epitome of reality. That's quite a statement, but
He is also a novelist.
I like it. Okay. So the thing that was sort of most surprising to me about this was that this sport sort of got its American start here in Minnesota, and not sort of, that the origin of ski jumping in America is right here. So if you hear that, listeners, you can go to your parties or wherever you're going and you have another Minnesota first that you can brag about. Is that right, Erica?
Yes. Took off pretty quickly in Michigan afterwards, but Minnesota was the birthplace. And that is thanks to immigrants from Norway. Ski jumping had and cross-country skiing both had sort of caught on as sports with races and jumping competitions right around the time that immigrants started coming to Minnesota.
Yeah. So there's something about just the winter grittiness of this that I think speaks so much to Minnesota's personality. The other day I was on Lake Harriet for the Art Shanty Festival, and there's people are flying kites, and there's so many ways that Minnesotans have tried to harness winter for their own joy. And this is one that goes back so far, and I love it. It's not something we see as much today, but it sounds like it was happening a lot back then.
Yeah, St. Paul is the oldest ski jumping club, and that goes all the way back to 1885.
Wow. Okay. So, and then the other thing to note is that the Ski Jumping Hall of Fame is here?
Yes, in Red Wing, where one of the earliest ski clubs, and actually the first national competition was held there.
Okay. This is in the St. James Hotel, which is a beautiful building if people haven't seen it. I stayed there once and then was walking through the halls, and it was kind of after hours, I guess. And I saw that this was there, but I couldn't go in. But I was like, whoa, that's interesting. And I just didn't know the whole history. There's like little pictures and stuff around too, just in the hallway.
Yeah,
anyway.
You'll have to go back.
Okay. So then we think of like cross-country skiing as a very Minnesota thing, and then like obviously like Nordic track and all these other things that kind of came out of that. But this was actually more popular, and that's another sort of, both of these are very Nordic, I guess, have Nordic origins. But this was more popular than cross-country skiing back in the day?
Yes, the sport was already established in Norway with competitions around the time that immigrants from that country started moving to Minnesota. And they brought the sport here with them. And it really took off, partly inspired by a pair of Norwegian brothers named Mikael and Torjus Hemmesvedt.
And they were like in their 20s.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think that there was a thrill involved with the jump that maybe a cross-country ski race couldn't quite bring about. So, yeah.
So you include a number of older photos in the story and things like this, but just explain to us, like, what was involved in this back in the day? Like, what did this kind of look like? Or what were they doing? Were they kind of, were they mounding snow? Were they putting up wooden structures? Or like, what's exactly happening?
Yeah, so a lot of places they would sort of take a natural hill, a place where you would have a natural lift and then building it up with wood, packing with snow.
But you sort of need a dip, right? It's like you need an incline to begin with, and you come down, and then you have an incline at the end.
Yeah, so you can lift off.
Okay.
Exactly.
Is the beginning sort of the natural part, and then you kind of build an incline at the end?
It seemed like it was kind of like built into the hill, the whole jump.
Okay.
Yeah.
But maybe there's a wooden structure at the jump part or something?
It depended. There were some that weren't.
Oh, that looks okay. This picture looks like the whole entire thing is somewhat wooden, maybe.
Yeah. This was a photo from 1911 that I found. There actually were tons of amazing photos.
Of course, because if you're a photographer at this time, what could be more thrilling than taking a picture of that? This is like people flying through the air. How often do you get to see that?
Exactly. Yeah. So some were just totally like you see these kind of rickety ladder staircases up to the top. And then other ones you can see that it will be like up on a hill and then built into it. And people are like climbing up in trees to watch and all gathered down below to see the jumpers. So they're really cool.
Okay. Before we started talking here, we were watching one of the record-breaking jumps on YouTube just to kind of get a sense of the modern version of this. And and it looks pretty smooth. I mean, the jumper's leaning into it, and they kind of like I don't know. It looks very seamless. I'm sure it's very difficult. I love the quote in your story though about these early days and what these landings were like. I mean, obviously that's the part of the jump that's the scariest. And it doesn't sound quite as smooth as what we saw in that video.
No, definitely not. I found lots of write-ups of the competitions. I think reporters loved going to them. But in the St. Paul Globe, there was an article about an 1891 Stillwater competition, and the reporter wrote that it got off to a chaotic start. Here's what he said. The first few runners landed in every direction, and skis and men occupied all positions imaginable, both on the ground and in the air. Occasionally, one would strike the ground as if every bone in his body was shattered, but the men would invariably pick themselves up, shake off the snow, and climb the hill again in preparation for another go.
You see what I'm saying about this gritty Minnesota thing? There's something about that description that like I can't even fathom. Like to look like every bone in your body is broken and then just to get up and sort of keep going. Like, I don't know.
Yeah. I have people write to me too that are like, oh, I'm sad I can't begin this sport now. But it is a sport that folks say is best begun as a child.
Oh, why?
I think because you're brave enough, you can start with a smaller jump and, less dangerous to land.
Okay. We'll be right back.
At Primrose, our balanced learning approach means exploring academic skills and life skills, combining purposeful play with nurturing guidance from teachers, and setting children up for success in future classrooms. Learn more at primroseschools.com/Twin Cities.
And we're back. Okay, this starts to take on, we were just talking about the 1890s, but this starts to get to be more of like a well-known sport, particularly in the 20s. So what sort of starts to happen then?
Well, the Winter Olympics debut in 1924, and ski jumping was one of the events. And then here in Minnesota in Red Wing, they hosted the National Ski Jumping Tournament in 1928. And one of the former club members said that it was like the Super Bowl of the sport. So it was like we got to host the major event. And during that campaign, some Red Wing boosters came up with a novel advertising campaign, and they collected red Copenhagen snuff tins and nailed them to fences and made signs. And these tins are called snooze boxes by Scandinavians. So the sign said, "Follow the snooze box trail to the tournament."
Oh, okay.
It was a big success.
That's very interesting. So one thing that I guess I was a little surprised by, but I guess is not, maybe I shouldn't be in the story, is that that downhill skiing is really kind of what reduced the draw of ski jumping, I guess, here. I guess I imagine, well, wasn't it just always around? But there were some things that opened that kind of made it so that people were more focused on more alpine type skiing.
Yeah, it turns out that alpine skiing wasn't really a thing here until the 1950s. Some of the places opened a little before that, but it didn't really take off until then. And even in like the 60s and 70s, ski jumping was a high school sport. So it did really kind of reach like critical mass here in Minnesota and was a big deal with jumps in cities, and parks would build their own all around the state for a while.
And we should just pause there. Like when we talk about the sport, what are we vying to do in this sport? Like what if you are a ski jumper, what is your goal?
Well, like at the Olympics, they score for distance and style. When I was looking at early competitions back in the 1800s, some of them were for longest and roughest jump, which I'm guessing I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, like so distance is makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
And then when we were looking at this video a second ago, I mean, essentially the jumper, they're both seemingly leaning forward and their skis are back so that their head and their skis are pretty seemingly close to each other, right? I mean,
they're flying through the air. The kite comparison really makes sense when you watch a ski jumper.
And you want to be sort of aerodynamic, I'm guessing?
Yeah, to go far and then have that perfect landing.
Yeah. Okay, so, I mean, it's great that we can say that we were really the hub of this, but then you reveal that we are no longer the hub of ski jumping, which is too bad, that it's gone on to places like more like kind of ski resort type towns. But so what happened? Yeah,
it turns out that here quite a few of the clubs have closed, and there's only 4 jumps left in Bloomington, Maplewood, Cloquet, and in Coleraine, Minnesota. And even though many of those clubs are still going strong, the main hubs of the sport are in Steamboat Springs, Colorado, Park City, Utah, and Lake Placid in New York. And the National USA Ski Jumping Organization is in Park City. So,
okay.
Yeah.
And then you mentioned how the whole sport has changed a bit. There's new rules and equipment and things and jump design. What's going on? So this is not quite what we read about in the 19th century. Things are a bit different now.
Yeah, Peter Guy told me that more recent changes have made it safer and that jumpers don't get quite as much height, and the sport adapted to include women ski jumpers fairly recently. They were able to join in the Olympics in 2014.
So, I mean, obviously they could have probably been doing this elsewhere, but the Olympics specifically.
Yes,
right.
Yes.
All right, so you told us the locations where people can do this today. Let's just maybe talk logistics if there's some people listening, maybe parents listening, whatever. What if they want to get involved or try this out, what do you do?
Yeah, if kids just want to try it out, many of the clubs do offer, I know in Bloomington at the Jump, they do a learn to fly course. And they're not jumping on the giant 70-meter jump. They have much smaller ones that kids can learn on. although it does need to be cold and snowy for this to happen. So that's something that clubs have run into in recent years.
And were you saying that it's preferable if you're a little younger? I mean, I don't want to age discriminate here, but like it's not something for a certain age group?
Yeah, a lot of jumpers. I mean, some people continue jumping later, but some of the folks I talked to stopped around 40. So not necessarily something to pick up in retirement.
Okay. And you noted in the story that like, even though we're not maybe the center of all this anymore, there's a lot of like Minnesota family traditions here, or this long family. Some families kind of go way back.
Yeah, Peter Guy said that his great uncle was the first jumper in his family, and then his dad jumped, and his brother, and now he and his brother's kids, 4 of them jump. So he said there's a really deep tradition and just kind of a special quality that gives the Minnesota jumpers.
What kind of feedback did you get after this?
I got so many great emails. So many people remembered their jumps in Duluth. There was a really cool one in Chester Bowl. I heard from ski jumpers who got national medals and were recounting. I think some folks are sad to see the sport shrink here and just really loved the opportunity to kind of go back and revisit it all. So it was fun.
Yeah, it sounds like a thrill.
Yes.
I mean, thinking back to those 19th century things, I mean, if you just think about it, like, what other context is someone going to be flying through the air, right? So I'm sure it was very remarkable to be.
Yeah. And I was lucky enough to talk to one of the many Minnesota Olympians, Jim Grahek, and he said that he grew up in Ely and, was a daredevil. So just started seeking out the little bunny hill jumps and then kept going from there.
Well, Erica, thank you so much.
Yeah,
fascinating
thank you.
Story. We love I don't know if this is a superlative. I don't know what we call this. We love a Minnesota first or a Minnesota America invention, and seems like we pioneered this one.
Yeah. I did hear from some readers questioning like, wait, what about Michigan? But no, it's just a few years later, folks.
Oh, so that was there's a whole other tale.
Yeah,
for
Michigan has a great history as well, to be real. But yeah.
All right. Thanks, Erica. Okay, that's it for today's show. Before we go, I have a quick correction from a previous episode. On our episode about the coldest temperature recorded in Minnesota, we said that negative 60 degrees Fahrenheit was 3 times colder than negative 20 degrees. A listener pointed out that this is not really how this works. Degrees Fahrenheit is a relative scale rather than an absolute scale, which is how temperature differences should be measured. So when measuring in an absolute scale, negative 60 degrees is about 9% colder than negative 20 degrees. Apologies for that, and please always feel free to reach out if we've slipped up about something. Thanks, as always, to Matt Gilmer for editing this podcast. Got feedback for us or a question you'd like us to tackle? Send us a note at curious@startribune.com. And if you're enjoying this show, please tell a friend about it. Thanks.
Thanks for listening to Curious Minnesota. We want to hear from you. Ask questions and read more stories online at startribune.com/curious. Our show is recorded at the Star Tribune's headquarters in beautiful downtown Minneapolis, and our music is produced by Matt Gilmer. If you like the show, please rate us on iTunes or leave a review. And until next time, stay curious.